The HOA chairwoman and 20 supporters stormed straight into my yard, armed with guns and clubs, holding up a forger document, snarling, "This lakefront land belongs to the community. Hand over the deed, or you'll regret it." They thought I was just some naive new resident, easy to intimidate. Barbara figured she was dealing with a vulnerable family that could be bullied, like always, but she completely misjudged the situation. In this house lives someone she would never want to anger, and in just a few minutes, the whole gang would wish they had never set foot on this property. Comment where you're watching from, because this story doesn't end here. Music, but let me back up and tell you how we got to that moment. Because trust me, you need the full picture to understand just how spectacularly Barbara Morrison screwed herself over. 2 weeks earlier, I was standing in the driveway of the most beautiful cabin I'd ever seen. Keys still warm in my palm from the lawyer's office. My grandfather had left me this slice of heaven on Clearwater Lake, complete with a dock that stretched into water so clear you could see fish swimming 20 feet down. The cabin itself was vintage 1962, Indige Carmel cedar logs and stone fireplace with windows that framed the lake like living paintings. My 16-year-old son Ryan was already exploring the property with the enthusiasm of a kid who just discovered buried treasure. "Dad, this place is insane," he called out from the dock. Grandpa knew how to pick a spot. I had to agree. After 15 years of cramped city apartments and neighbors who complained if you sneezed too loudly, this felt like winning the lottery. The plan was simple: convert the place into my home office, maybe do some freelance constant work while Ryan finished high school. Remote work had its perks, and this view sure beat my old cubicle. The morning air smelled like pine and possibility, and for the first time in months, I felt like things were finally looking up for the Westbrook family. That optimistic feeling lasted exactly 13 days. I was on my laptop trying to figure out the quirks of the cabin's ancient Wi-Fi router when I heard footsteps crunching across the gravel. Through the window, I saw a woman marching toward my front door with the determination of someone who owneth this place. She was maybe 52, with perfectly coiffed blonde hair, and carrying what appeared to be a bright pink clipboard like it was some kind of weapon. Behind her trailed a guy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, carrying what I would later learn was a laser measuring device. The knock on my door wasn't a knock. It was more like a declaration of war. "Hello there," she announced when I opened the door, not waiting for me to respond. "I'm Barbara Morrison, chairwoman of the Clearwater Lake Homeowners Association, and we need to discuss some serious violations on this property." She held up her pink clipboard like it was a court, summons pen poised like she was about to write my obituary. I blinked, still holding my coffee mug. "Violations? I just moved in 2 weeks ago." "Exactly," Barbara said, stepping past me onto my porch without invitation. 2 weeks of unchecked deterioration. First infraction: your grass exceeds our community standard of 3 and Gerald measure it. The poor guy with the laser device. Apparently, Gerald shuffled forward and aimed his gadget at my lawn like he was defusing a bomb. 3.7 and he announced with the enthusiasm of a man reading his death sentence. "You arresting me for grass length?" I asked, wondering if I'd somehow wandered into a hidden camera show. Barbara scribbled furiously on her pink clipboard. "Community standards exist for a reason, Mr." She paused expectantly. "Westbrook, Marcus Westbrook, Mr. Westbrook," she continued without missing a beat. "Property values in this community are maintained through strict adherence to our guidelines. Your Lonnie's a direct threat to neighborhood harmony." She gestured toward the lake with her pen. "And we haven't even discussed the main issue yet." That's when she dropped the first bomb. "This lakefront area you're enjoying, that's a community common space. You're technically trespassing on HOA property every time you step outside your cabin." I felt my coffee mug paused halfway to my lips. "Excuse me. The lakefront access belongs to the community," Barbara explained with the patience of someone talking to a particularly slow child. "Your grandfather may have had some informal arrangement, but those days are over. We run a professional operation now." She pulled out her phone, and I kid you not, started recording herself, documenting initial violation assessment for property at 1247 Lakeshore Drive. She announced to her phone camera, "Resident appears to be unaware of community standards and common area restrictions from inside the cabin." I heard Ryan's voice. "Dad, is that lady seriously making a TikTok about our grass?" Barbara's eye twitched at the word TikTok, but she continued her documentation with the dedication of a war correspondent. "As you can see, the property owner has made no effort to maintain community standards, and worse, seems to believe he has exclusive rights to lakefront access that belongs to all." The absurdity of the situation was starting to dawn on me. This woman had shown up at my door, criticized my lawn with a laser measuring device, and was now live streaming her complaints to whoever was unfortunate enough to be watching. "Look, Mrs. Morrison, Chairwoman Morrison, good Chairwoman Morrison," I continued, already tired of this conversation. "I have the deed to this property. It includes lakefront access. My grandfather lived here for 30 years without any problems." Barbara's smile cowled have powered a small city with its sheer wattage of condescension. Oh, Mr. Westbrook, you clearly don't understand how modern community management works. Things have changed significantly since your grandfather's time. We've updated our jurisdiction and enforcement protocols. That deed you're referring to, I'm afraid it doesn't carry Hewitt. You think it does. She tucked her pink clipboard under her arm and fixed me with a look that somehow managed Tobe, both pitying and threatening. I'll give you 24 hours to bring that grass into compliance and cease using the lakefront area. Consider this your only friendly warning. She turned to leave, then paused like she'd forgotten something important. Oh, and Mr. Westbrook, everyone in this community watches out for each other. Word travels fast around here about residents who refuse to be cooperative. Gerald hurried after her, his laser measuring device clutched to his chest like a security blanket. I watched him walk back down me driveway, Barbara's voice carrying back to me as she continued documenting our encounter for her invisible audience. Initial contact complete. The resident shows typical signs of newcomer assistance to community standards. Will reassess compliance in 24 hours. I stood in my porch, coffee mug still in hand, trying to process what had just happened. Inside the cabin, Ryan appeared at the window, shaking his head. Dad, I hate to break it to you, but I think we just met the final boss of all Karens, and she's got a laser. That's when I should have known this was just the beginning. Barbara Morrison hadn't driven out here just to complain about my grass. She had something bigger planned, something that would make our first encounter look like a friendly neighborhood chat, and unfortunately for both of us, I was about to find out that's when someone tries to take what belongs to your family. The quiet software engineer isn't always the easy target you expect. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because what happened next would teach me that sometimes the most dangerous battles are fought not with fists but with pink clipboards, fake legal documents, and the kind of community politics that make small-town drama look like amateur hour. 24 hours later, Barbara Morrison would return tummy property, and this time she wouldn't be coming alone. Barbara's 24-hour deadline came and went like a bad joke. I'd spent exactly 0 minutes worrying about my grass length, figuring that any reasonable person would realize how ridiculous the whole situation was. Boy, was I wrong about the reasonable person part. At exactly 9 a.m. the next morning, I heard the rumble of multiple vehicles in my driveway. Through the kitchen window, I watched Barbara emerge from a white SUV, like some kind of suburban warlord, followed by 5 people in matching polo shirts that read HOA compliance officers. She'd brought backup and they were carrying what appeared to be a portable printer who brings office equipment to a grass dispute. Mr. Westbrook, Barbara called out as I opened the front door, her voice carrying the fake cheerfulness of a customer service representative who's about to ruin your day. I see you've chosen not to address the violations we discussed yesterday. That's unfortunate, but not unexpected. Gerald, please confirm. The grass measurements? Gerald, apparently promoted to chief law enforcement officer, dutifully aimed his laser device at various spots around my property, while Barbara supervised with intensity of a general planning a military campaign. The whole scene was so absurd that I started laughing. You seriously brought 5 people and a printer to measure my grass again? Barbara's smile tightened into something that belonged in a horror movie. Mr. Westbrook, I can see you don't take community standards seriously. That attitude is exactly what's wrong with this neighborhood. She gestured to one of her polo-shirted minions, who immediately fired up the portable printer with the efficiency of a NASCAR pit crew. Since you've refused to comply with our reasonable request, you're now subject to our escalated enforcement protocol. The printer turned out a document that looked official enough to fool someone who'd never seen actual legal paperwork. Barbara presented it to him with a flourish that would have made a game show host proud. Violation notice. Unauthorized lakefront usage. Failure to maintain community standards. And she paused for dramatic effect. Disruption of neighborhood harmony. Total fine. $200. Payable within 24 hours. I stared at the paper, which looked like it had been designed by someone who'd learned about legal documents from watching Law & Order reruns. This is insane. You can't just fine me for using my property. Barbara pulled out her phone and switched it to what I now recognized as her documentation mode. Instead of live streaming like yesterday, she was using some kind of professional camera app, recording everything with the systematic precision of a crime scene investigator. Mr. Westbrook is now refusing token-eligible legitimate community enforcement, she announced to her phone. This behavior pattern is consistent with residents who believe they're above community standards. The camera thing was more unsettling than her clipboard theatrics. Something was calculating about the way she framed each shot, like she was building a case rather than just complaining about grass. You know what I said? My patience is finally running out. Let me see the legal documentation that gives your HOA authority over my property. Show me the papers that prove you have jurisdiction here. Barbara's expressions shifted slightly, like I'd asked her to solve calculus in her head. The community voted on these standards. Mr. Westbrook, we don't need to provide you with internal documentation. What we need is compliance. She gestured broadly toward the lake. This entire lakefront area is designated community space. Your grandfather may have had some informal understanding with previous management, but we operate under professional guidelines now. One of her polo-shirted assassins stepped forward with what appeared to be a laminated map. As you can see, Barbara continued, Thebo and debris are marked. Your cabin sits on approved residential space, but everything from that tree line to Thebo belongs to the community. The map looked like it had been made in Microsoft Paint by someone with a shaky understanding of property law. I'm afraid your deed doesn't supersede community jurisdiction in common areas. That's when Ryan appeared in the doorway, took one look at the circus in our driveway, and said exactly what I was thinking. Dad, are these people for real? They brought a whole printer just to give you a fake ticket. Barbara's eye twitched at the word fake, but she maintained her professional composure. Young man, this is official hobusiness. Perhaps your father should have taught you about respecting community authority. Ryan, bless his 16-year-old heart, looked at Barbara like she just claimed the earth was flat. Lady, my dad's got the deed. This place. You can't just show up with a printer and declare yourself the boss of our backyard. Barbara's smile became even more strained. I can see where the disrespect for authority comes from in this household. Mr. Westbrook, you have 24 hours to pay this fine. After that, the entire community will know exactly what kind of neighbor you choose to be. She tucked her documentation camera away and gathered her compliance team with the efficiency of a military retreat. We'll be back tomorrow to reassess the situation. I suggest you use that tomato. Consider whether you want to be known as the resident who fights reasonable community standards. As her convoy pulled out of my driveway, I could hear her voice through her open window, still documenting. Subject shows persistent resistance to community integration. Escalation protocols may be necessary. I stood there holding their ridiculous fine notice, feeling like I'd just been pranked by the world's most organized group of middle-aged suburban vigilantes. Ryan shook his head and headed back inside. Dad, I'm Ordier in Giza. Dealing with crazy people makes me hungry. As I followed him into the cabin, I realized I needed to start taking this seriously. Barbara Morrison wasn't just some overzealous neighbor with too much time on her hands. She was systematic, organized, and clearly had some kind of larger plan. That evening, while Ryan demolished half a pizza and complained about his homework, I started researching HOA law and property rights. The more I read, the more convinced I became that Barbara was running some kind of elaborate scam. But I also realized I needed professional help, so I called the lawyer who'd handled my grandfather's estate. Of course, he was booked solid for the next week. Meanwhile, I was apparently on the clock for some kind of community judgment day. It was Ryan who made the discovery thought would change everything. Dad, he called from the basement, you need to see this. Grandpa left something down here. He was standing next to an old safe I'd never noticed before, partially hidden behind some storage boxes. The combination lock looked like it hadn't been opened in years, but there was a note taped to the top in my grandfather's handwriting. For Marcus. When the vultures come calling, I stared at that note, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the basement temperature. Somehow, my grandfather had known this day would come. Whatever was in that safe, he'd left it specifically for a situation like this. As I started working on the combination, using dates that meant something to our family, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to discover something that would turn this whole crazy situation upside down. But I had no idea just how right I was about that. The safe combination turned out to be easier than I'd expected. My grandfather had always been sentimental about family dates, and Sharino, my grandmother's birthday, did the trick. The heavy door swung open with a satisfying click, revealing a collection of documents that would make any conspiracy theorist weep with joy. The first thing I pulled out was a hand-drawn map that looked nothing like Barbara's Microsoft Paint masterpiece. This was a legitimate surveyor's map from 1987, complete with official stamps and signatures showing the exact boundaries off my grandfather's property. And here's the kicker. The lakefront access wasn't just included, it was specifically in bright yellow marker with a note in my grandfather's careful handwriting. Private property, not subject to any homeowner association now or in the future. But that wasn't the best part. Underneath the survey map was a letter addressed to me, dated just 2 years ago. My hands were shaking as I unfolded it, recognizing my grandfather's distinctive scroll. Marcus, it began. If you're reading this, then those greedy vultures are at it again. I fought this battle 15 years ago, and won, but I always knew they'd come back eventually. Barbara Morrison thinks she's clever, but she's been sniffing around this property since before you were born. Don't let her steal what belongs to our family. Ryan leaned over my shoulder, reading along. Grandpa knew about Barbara. That's insane. How long has this lady been obsessed with our property? I kept reading, my grandfather's words, painting a picture of a much larger scheme than I'd imagined. Barbara had tried this same routine back in 2008, claiming the HOA had expanded its jurisdiction to include pre-existing properties. My grandfather had hired a lawyer, taken her to court, and won decisively. The court had ruled that properties predating the HOA establishment were completely exempt from association control. But here's where it got really interesting. At the bottom of the safe was a manila envelope labeled insurance policy in my grandfather's handwriting. Inside were photographs, and when I saw what they showed, I understood why he'd kept them locked away. The photos were taken with a telephoto lens showing Barbara, Morrison, and a man in an expensive suit surveying the lakefront area. The Times showed they were taken over several different visits, always when they thought no one was watching. The man in the suit was some kind of developer or real estate investor, based in the blueprints they were reviewing in several shots. "Dad, look at this one," Ryan said, pointing to a photo where Barbara and the mystery man were standing right on our dock, gesturing toward the cabin like they owned Theplis. "She's been planning this for years, hasn't she?" The evidence was right there in black and white. Barbara had been working with outside interests, probably planning to force out the current residents and sell the lakefront properties to developers. I started laying out all the documents on the basement floor, creating a timeline of Barbara's schemes. My grandfather had been incredibly thorough, documenting every interaction, every legal challenge, and every underhanded tactic she'd employed over the years. There were copies of fake HOA documents similar to what she'd shown me, all stamped with official-looking seals that turned out to be completely fraudulent. There were witness statements from other neighbors who'd been harassed with similar tactics. And most damning of all, there were financial records showing Barbara's connection to something called Lakeshore Development LLC. "This is unbelievable," I muttered, staring at a document that showed Barbara as a silent partner in a company specialized in acquiring lakefront properties for resort development. She's not just some power-hungry HOA chairwoman. She's trying to steal people's land to make money. Ryan was taking photos of everything with his phone, his teenage sense of injustice fully activated. "Dad, we have to expose her. This is fraud, right? Like actual criminal fraud." He was right, but I also knew that having evidence and getting justice were two very different things. Barbara had spent years building her little empire of fear and intimidation, convincing neighbors to go along with her schemes through a combination of fake authority and social pressure. Simply showing up with documents might not be enough to stop someone who committed to her con game. That's when I heard footsteps on the basement stairs. "Marcus, Ryan, you boys okay down there?" It was our neighbor Pete Kowalski, an elderly man who'd lived next door for decades. I'd barely spoken to him since moving in, but something about his tone suggested this wasn't a casual social visit. "Pete, yeah, we're fine, just going through some of my grandfather's things." Pete descended the stairs slowly, his weathered face serious. "I saw Barbara's little parade this morning. Figured it was time someone told you what you're dealing with." He glanced at the documents spread across the floor, nodding like he'd expected to find them. "Your grandfather was a good man, Marcus. He tried to warn everyone about Barbara, but most folks were too scared to listen. She's got a way of making people think she's got more power than she does." "Pete," I said, "how long have you known about her connection to developers?" The old man's expression darkened. "Son, I've been watching strange cars cruise through this neighborhood for the past 2 years. Expensive cars, with people taking pictures and measurements when they think nobody's looking. Barbara's always right there with them, playing tour guide. She's been selling out this whole community piece by piece, and most folks don't even realize it." Pete sat down heavily on an old crate, suddenly looking every one of his 70-some years. "I've got photos too if you need them. Been documenting everything. Since your grandfather asked me to keep an eye on things, he knew she'd come after this place eventually. It's the prime lakefront property she needs to make her development deal work." The weight of what Pete was telling me settled in my stomach like a lead brick. This wasn't just about my property anymore. It was about Barbara's systematic campaign to force out longtime residents and hand their homes over to resort developers. "So, what do we do?" Ryan asked, looking between Pete and me. "We can't just let her keep scaring people and stealing their property." Pete smiled for the first time since he'd come downstairs. "Well, your grandfather always said, the best defense against a bully is macking her. Everyone knows what they're really up to. Maybe it's time Barbara Morrison learned that some folks fight back." HOA started planning our confrontation with Barbara. I realized that tomorrow's conversation was going to be very different from what she was expecting. She thought she was dealing with an easy mark, someone who'd roll over and pay her fake fines rather than make waves. But she was about to discover that sometimes the quiet software engineer has a few tricks up his sleeve, especially when he's got a basement full of evidence and a neighbor willing to testify about years of systematic fraud. But I had no idea that Barbara Morrison was already 3 steps ahead of us. And/or evidence was about to become just another piece in her much larger game. I spent half the night organizing my grandfather's evidence into what I thought was an unbeatable case. Survey maps, court documents, and photographs of Barbara's secret meetings with developers. It was like having a royal flush in a poker game. Ryan had set up his audio recorder in the living room, hidden behind some books on the shelf. We were ready for Barbara's inevitable return, armed with enough proof to shut down her little empire of lies. She showed up at exactly 9 a.m. again, this time alone, except for Gerald and his trusty laser device. The confidence radiating from her was almost palpable as she marched up my driveway, pink clipboard in hand like a battle standard. "Mr. Westbrook, she called out before I'd even fully opened the door. I assume you're ready to discuss payment of your outstanding finance with community standards. Her smile was the kind you see on sharks right before they attack. Barbara, think. We need to discuss something else entirely. I stepped onto the porch, carrying a folder containing copies of my grandfather's documents. I've been doing some research into your claims about HOA jurisdiction over my property. Her smile flickered slightly, but she maintained her professional composure. Mr. Westbrook, I don't have time for amateur legal research. Either you're ready to be a cooperative member of this community, or you're choosing to be a... I opened the folder and pulled out the 1987 survey map, unfolding it with the dramatic flair of a magician, revealing his final trick. This is the official survey of my property, showing clear private ownership of all lakefront access. According to this document and the court ruling from 2008, my land has never been and can never be subject to HOA control. Barbara glanced at the map and for just a moment, I saw something flicker behind her eyes. Not surprise exactly, but more like irritation. Faded, found something I wasn't supposed to have. Mr. Westbrook, she said, her voice taking on a patronizing tone. Those old papers don't mean anything anymore. Community standards have evolved since your grandfather's time. We've updated our jurisdiction through proper legal channels. She gestured to Gerald, who immediately started setting up what appeared to be a smartphone on a small tripod. Gerald, please document this conversation. Mr. Westbrook is attempting to dispute legitimate HOA authority with outdated documentation. The fact that she was recording threshold have been my first clue that something was off, but I was too focused on presenting my evidence to pay attention to the warning signs. Barbara, these aren't just old papers. This is a legally binding survey and a court judgment that specifically states this property is exempt from HOA control. I pulled out the photographs of her meetings with the developer, and I'm curious about your relationship with Lakeshore Development LLC. That's when her mask slipped completely. The fake smile vanished, replaced by the cold calculation of someone who'd been caught but wasn't ready to admit defeat. I see you've been quite busy, Mr. Westbrook, but you're making a fundamental mistake about how community governance works in the modern era. She reached into her bag and pulled out what looked like a legal document, far more official than the fake fine she'd given me yesterday. This is a community petition signed by 53 residents requesting your immediate removal from lakefront access due to your persistent disruption of neighborhood peace. I stared at the petition, feeling like I'd been punched. The signatures looked real. The document had official stamps, and worst of all, I recognized some of the names. These were my neighbors, people I'd barely met, apparently united in their desire to see me gone. This is impossible, I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I could see Barbara's confidence returning in full force. Mr. Westbrook, you seem to think this is about old property lines and grandfather's wishes, Barbara said, her voice now carrying the authority of someone who held all the cards. But this is about community safety and property values. When a resident shows up and immediately starts causing problems, refusing to follow basic guidelines, Anthon begins harassing community leadership with conspiracy theories about development. Companies shegashered broadly as if my entire existence was evidence of some criminal conspiracy. Gerald's phone was capturing every word, every gesture, and I realized with growing horror that I was being set up. This wasn't a conversation about property rights. It was a performance designed to make me look like an unhinged new resident who couldn't accept reasonable community standards. You're live streaming this, aren't you? I asked, suddenly understanding the scope of what washed upon you. Barbara's smile returned in full force. Mr. Westbrook, transparency is fundamental to good community. Our residents deserve to see how we handle difficult situations like this. She held up her pink clipboard, and I could see now that it had a small camera attached to the top. This live stream currently has over 200 viewers, many of whom are your concerned neighbors watching you refuse to accept basic community cooperation. The trapdoor is so elegant, I almost had to admire it. While I'd been gathering evidence about her past schemes, Barbara had been building a narrative about me as the problem neighbor, the outside agitator who showed up and immediately started causing trouble. Every interaction had been carefully documented and presented to the community as evidence of my unwillingness to be a good neighbor. This is insane, I said, but I could hear how defensive and desperate I sounded. Mr. Westbrook, Barbara continued, her voice now carrying the patient tone of a teacher explaining basic concepts to a slow student. I'm going to give you one more opportunity to resolve this peacefully. We're holding a community meeting tonight at 7 p.m. at the community center. You can come and address the concerns of your neighbors directly, or you can continue down this path of hostility and legal threats. She folded up her petition with the satisfied air of someone who just won Aces match in 4 moves. As she and Gerald walked back to their car, I could hear her voice continuing her live stream commentary. As you can see, residents who refuse to engage constructively with community leadership often escalate to harassment and intimidation tactics. Tonight's meeting will give everyone a chance to hear both sides and make an informed decision about how to proceed. The car doors slammed shut and they drove away, leaving me standing on my porch with my useless folder of evidence. Back inside, Ryan emerged from his hiding spot behind the bookshelf, shaking his head. Dad, she played us completely. While we were getting ready to prove she was lying about property law, she was busy convincing the whole neighborhood that you're the crazy one. He was right. And the worst part was that I could see exactly how she'd done it. Every aggressive move I'd planned to make will just reinforce her narrative about the problem neighbor who couldn't accept reasonable community standards. That afternoon, an envelope appeared under my door with no signature or return address. Inside was a single piece of paper with a brief message written in block letters. Check the county records for Lakeshore Development LLC. A trap. You're walking into an ambush. I stared at that anonymous warning, realizing that someone else in this community knew exactly what Barbara was planning, and they were trying to help me avoid making a But as I prepared for the community meeting that evening, I had no idea just how right that anonymous tipster was about the ambush part. Walking into the Clearwater Lake Community Center felt like entering enemy territory. The parking lot was packed with more cars than I'd seen since moving here, and through windows, I could see at least 40 people crowded into a room that usually hosted bingo nights and book clubs. Barbara had turned my property dispute into the neighborhood's main event. The moment I stepped inside, conversations stopped. Every head turned toward me like I'd walked into a saloon in an old Western movie. The seating arrangement told me everything I needed to know about how this evening would go. Folding chairs were arranged in neat rows facing Asmal's stage, where Barbara stood behind a podium, looking like she was about to deliver a State of the Union address. She wore a navy blazer that screamed serious authority figure, and behind her hung a large screen displaying a slideshow titled Protecting Our Community Values. Mr. Westbrook, Barbara owns with the kind of fake warmth that makes your skin crawl. So wonderful that you could join us tonight. Please find any seat that feels comfortable. The way she emphasized comfortable made it clear that nowhere in this room would I feel anything close to comfortable. I chose a spot near the back, hoping to observe the crowd before Barbara lounged into whatever performance she'd prepared. What I saw wasn't encouraging. Most faces were strangers, people who'd been recruited specifically for tonight's show. Ryan had wanted to come for moral support, but I'd insisted on facing this alone. Now surrounded by hostile stares and whispered conversations, I was second-guessing that decision. More concerning was Pete's absence. The old man had seemed genuinely committed to exposing Barbara's schemes, but his empty chair suggested either discretion or something more troubling. Barbara called the meeting to order with practiced authority. Friends and neighbors, thank you for prioritizing our community's well-being tonight. We're here to address a situation that threatens the safety and property values we've all worked so hard to protect. She clicked a remote, and the screen filled with photos of my cabin taken from so that somehow made my peaceful lakefront home look ominous and out of place. As documented here, Barbara continued, gesturing at images of my slightly overgrown grass shot with telephoto precision. We have a new resident who has consistently refused to meet basic community standards. Despite multiple good faith attempts at cooperation, Mr. Westbrook has rejected reasonable guidelines and claimed exclusive rights to shared community resources. The photos had been carefully selected and cropped to make my property maintenance look negligent rather than simply relaxed. But her masterstroke came next. Barbara presented what she called audio evidence of disruptive behavior, playing edited clips from our previous conversations. Somehow she'd spliced together moments where I sounded frustrated or defensive while removing all context about her. My voice saying, "This is insane," echoed through the room twice, each time generating disapproving murmurs from the audience. Furthermore, Barbara said, building toward her climax, Mr. Westbrook has made paranoid accusations about community leadership, suggesting we're involved in elaborate conspiracies with outside developers. This kind of unfounded hostility creates exactly the atmosphere of suspicion and fear that destroys neighborhood harmony. She paused dramatically, scanning the room like a prosecutor addressing a jury. Tonight, we must decide whether one resident's refusal to cooperate should be allowed to undermine everything we've built together. That's when she revealed her secret weapon. A man in an expensive suit rose from the front row, and Barbara introduced him as a legal expert who's thoroughly reviewed Mr. Westbrook's property claims. My blood ran cold as I recognized him from my grandfather's photographs. This was the developer who'd been secretly meeting with Barbara, now masquerading as an impartial legal authority. Ladies and gentlemen, the fake lawyer began with practiced confidence. I've examined the documents Mr. Westbrook presented, and unfortunately, they lack the legal authority he believes they possess. Property law has evolved significantly since the 1980 Pandan. Current community standards take precedence over individual deed restrictions when public safety and neighborhood stability are concerned. He delivered this complete fabrication with the smooth assurance of someone who'd convinced many people that lies were legal facts. I started to stand ready to challenge this obvious fraud with my grandfather's evidence. But Barbara smoothly intercepted, Mr. Westbrook, you'll have your opportunity to respond after we hear from community members directly affected by this situation. She gestured to the audience, and suddenly, people were standing to share their concerns about my impact on neighborhood life. The testimonies were choreographed, too similar in structure and perfectly aligned with Barbara's narrative to be genuine. A woman I'd never seen complained about increased disruption since my arrival. A man from 3 blocks away expressed about property values due to my confrontational approach to community cooperation. Most damaging were Savara witnesses who claimed they'd personally observed me verbally attacking Barbara during our encounters. As testimony after testimony painted me as a neighborhood menace, I realized the full scope of Barbara's preparation. This wasn't just tonight's meeting. She'd been constructing this case against me from my first day here. Every interaction had been documented, edited, and presented to build a narrative that cast me as the villain, disrupting their peaceful community. The woman was a master manipulator, and I'd walked directly into her carefully laid trap. When the testimonies ended, Barbara proposed a community resolution that was elegant in its simplicity. Marcus Westbrook would voluntarily cease lakefront access and comply with all community standards or appropriate a maze to protect neighborhood safety and property values. The vote wasn't remotely close. 35 in favor, 8 against. I'd been democratically exiled from my property as people filed out without making eye contact. I remained seated, processing the complete disaster that had just unfolded. Barbara approached with the satisfied expression of someone who'd executed a perfect plan. "Mr. Westbrook," she said with theatrical sympathy, "I hope you understand this isn't personal. The community has spoken clearly. You have until tomorrow evening to inform me of your compliance decision." Walking to my car, I found Deputy Sarah Martinez waiting in civilian clothes, her expression serious. "Mr. Westbrook, I've been monitoring this situation, and Zamathan feels very wrong about tonight's proceedings. I believe you're being positioned for something significantly worse than a community vote." That conversation with Deputy Martinez made me realize that tonight's humiliation was merely the opening move in Barbara's larger game, and whatever came next would make this community meeting look like a friendly neighborhood discussion. You know, having grown up here in Chicago and witnessed plenty of neighborhood drama over the years, I've got to ask, have you ever been in a situation where someone completely controlled the narrative against you? What would you do if you were Marcus right now, facing a whole community that's been turned against you? Drop your thoughts in the comments below because trust me, this story is about to take a turn that nobody saw coming. I barely slept that night, Deputy Martinez's warning echoing in my head about something worse coming. I should have trusted that instinct because at exactly 6 a.m., I was jolted awake by the sound of multi-clavicles crunching across my gravel driveway. Through the bedroom window, I watched in disbelief as Barbara emerged from a black SUV, followed by 20 people dressed in dark clothing, some carrying what appeared to be clubs, others with what looked suspiciously like firearms and holsters. "Ryan, stay inside and call 911. I whispered urgently as my son appeared in the hallway, still in his pajamas, but instantly alert to the danger. "Tell them we have armed trespassers on private property." I grabbed my phone and started recording as Barbara marched toward my front door with the confidence of someone who believed she owned the place. Behind her, her security volunteers spread out across my yard like they were conducting a military operation. The knock on my door was more like a police raid. "Mr. Westbrook." Barbara's voice carried through the woods with artificial authority. "This is your final opportunity to resolve this situation peacefully. We have a court order requiring you to vacate this property." I opened the door to find her holding what appeared to be an official legal document, complete with seals and signatures that looked convincing enough to fool anyone who didn't examine them closely. "Barbara, you and your friends need to leave my property right now," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite adrenaline flooding my system. "You're trespassing, and some of your people appear to be armed." She smiled that shark-like grin I'd come to know and hate. "Mr. Westbrook, we're not trespassing. This lakefront land belongs to the community, and you've been given multiple opportunities to comply with legal requirements. Hand over your property deed or you'll regret this decision." That's when I realized we'd reached the moment for my Boris opening, the confrontation that had been building since Barbara first appeared with her pink clipboard. She thought dealing with a helpless family she could intimidate into submission, just like she'd probably done to other residents over the years. But she'd made a critical miscalculation about who she was facing. "I'm not giving you anything," I said, stepping onto my porch despite the armed crowd surrounding my home. "This is private property, and you have no legal authority here." Barbara's eyes flashed with something between rage and triumph. "Document this final refusal to comply with community authority," she called out. But instead of Gerald with his laser device, one of her security team was operating what looked like a professional drone, hovering above my property and recording everything. "Mr. Westbrook," Barbara announced loudly enough for the drone's microphone, topic up clearly. "You are now in violation of a lawful community order and pose a direct threat to neighborhood safety citizens of Clearwater Lake. This man has refused every reasonable attempt at cooperation and must bear a moved from community property immediately." That's when the cavalry arrived. The sound of police sirens cut through the morning air, and 3 patrol cars came racing up my driveway with lights flashing. Deputy Martinez jumped out of the lead car, followed by 2 other officers, and the entire dynamic shifted in an instant. Everyone step back from the property and lower any weapons immediately, Martinez commanded with the kind of authority that comes from actual legal power rather than Barbara's manufactured version. Deputy Martinez, Barbara called out, her confidence wavering slightly. We're conducting lawful community business. Under proper authority, this resident has been given multiple opportunities to comply with legitimate orders. She held up her fake court document like it was a shield against reality. I'm afraid you don't understand the situation here, Mrs. Morrison. I understand this situation perfectly, Martinez replied, pulling out her own set of documents. Thanks to Mr. Pete Kowalski, who spent yesterday afternoon at the county records office. We have copies of all legitimate property documentation for this area. We also have evidence of your partnership with Lakeshore Development LLC and your systematic fraud against multiple residents. The look on Barbara's face was worth every moment of stress she'd put me through. Pet emerged from behind one of the police cars, carrying a box of documents and looking like he just won the lottery. Sorry I missed the community meeting last night, Marcus, he called out. I was too busy at the courthouse, copying every piece of evidence we need to shut down this whole scam. Martinez continued her explanation, while Barbara's security volunteers began quietly dispersing, apparently realizing they'd been recruited for something that wasn't remotely legal. Mrs. Morrison, you're under arrest for fraud, intimidation, and conspiracy to commit theft of real property. The fake legal expert from last night's meeting has already been taken into custody, along with documentation proving your scheme to force residents off lakefront properties for development purposes. This is ridiculous, Barbara sputtered, but her voice had lost all its authoritative power. I am a respected community leader. These are nothing but conspiracy theories from a disruptive heretic who refuses to follow reasonable guidelines. She still clutched her pink clipboard like it could somehow restore her authority, but Martinez was already reading her rights. The most satisfying moment came when Ryan emerged from the house, holding his phone and grinning broadly. Dad, I've been streaming this whole thing live on social media. Barbara's got about 300 people watching her get arrested right now. The irony was perfect. Barbara's tactics turned against her in the most public way possible. As Martinez led Barbara to the patrol car, the fake community leader made one last desperate team to control the narrative. This is a mistake, she called out to her remaining supporters. Marcus Westbrook is a dangerous individual who's manipulated law enforcement with lies and forged documents. But her words carried no weight now, and the few people who hadn't already left were backing away from her like she was. By the way, Martinez said to me, as Barbara was secured in the back of the patrol car, we found evidence that she's been running similar scams in 3 other lakefront communities over the past 5 years. Your grandfather's Doshantan and Pete's detective work just helped us connect all the pieces. She handed me a business card from the district attorney's office. They'll want to interview you about your experiences, but this case is going to put her away for a long time. As the police cars drove away with Barbara and her fake legal expert in custody, I stood in my driveway surrounded by the evidence of her elaborate scheme. The drone lay abandoned in my yard, still recording nothing but blue sky. Her pink clipboard was scattered across my gravel, finally stripped of its imaginary authority. Ryan was still live streaming, narrating the aftermath for his growing audience of viewers who'd watched the holy confrontation unfold. Dad, Ryan said, lowering his phone finally, I think we just won the craziest neighborhood dispute in history. He was right. But as I looked around at my peaceful lakefront property, I realized the victory was about more than just keeping my land. It was about standing up to someone who'd built an empire on fear and intimidation, and proving that sometimes the quiet software engineer is exactly the person you don't want to underestimate. But even as I savored the moment of triumph, I had no idea that this was just the beginning of a much larger story about community corruption and what happens when ordinary people decide to fight back against systematic fraud. 3 weeks after Barbara's arrest, the Clearwater Lake Community Center felt like an entirely different place. Over 60 neighbors had gathered for what Pete called the real community meeting, and instead of hostile stares, I was receiving handshakes, apologies, and enough homemade casseroles to feed Aunt me. Marcus, I owe you the biggest apology, said Janet Coleman, the same woman who testified about my disruptive behavior at Barbara's stage trial. Barbara told us you were planning to subdivide your property for commercial development. We were so terrified about the property values that we never questioned whether she was lying. Her embarrassment was genuine, and frankly, it felt good to see people finally understand how completely they'd been manipulated. The truth about Barbara's scheme had spread through the neighborhood faster than gossip at a high school reunion. 12 families had come forward with similar stories of intimidation, fake fines, and threats about their property rights. Barbara hadn't been targeting just me. She'd been systematically going after anyone who owned prime lakefront land, using legal-sounding documents and social pressure to convince them to sell to Lakeshore Development LLC at bargain prices. The twisted part, Pete explained to the crowd, is that she planned this whole thing for at least 3 years. She specifically moved here and got herself elected HOA chairwoman just to set up this elaborate con game. He held up a thick folder from the county records office. She wasn't just stealing individual properties. She was working to destroy our entire community so some resort company could buy up the whole lakefront for nothing. Ryan had become something of a local celebrity after his live stream of Barbara's arrest went viral with over 50,000 views. Tonight he was documenting this meeting for very different reasons. This is what real community looks like, he told his phone camera, when people work together instead of letting someone manipulate them with fear and lies. Deputy Martinez, now Detective Martinez, thanks to her promotion following the case, stood to address the group. What happened here was part of a much larger criminal network, she explained. Barbara Morrison was connected to similar fraud getting lakefront communities across 3 states. Your courage in fighting back has helped us build cases that will protect hundreds of other families from these same tactics. The evening's biggest surprise came when the community unanimously voted to elect me as interim HOA president. The irony wasn't lost on Onion, least of all me. I never wanted this job, I admitted. But maybe we can use it to completely rebuild how our community operates. No more intimidation tactics, no more fake authority, just neighbors helping neighbors maintain the place we all love. Our new HOA bylaws looked nothing like Barbaros Authorian rulebook. Instead of measuring grass with laser precision, we focused on actual community needs, like maintaining the shared dock, organizing lake cleanup efforts, and creating a genuine neighborhood watch program. Monthly meetings would be real discussions about community issues, not theatrical trials designed to excel in convent residents. As people started heading home, I found myself on the community center deck, looking out over the lake that had caused so much conflict. Ryan joined me, still processing everything that had happened since Barbara first appeared with her pink clipboard. Dad, do you think Grandpa knew this would happen when he left you that safe? Did he know Barbara would try the same scheme again? Before I could answer, Pete appeared carrying a wooden box I'd never seen before. I think he knew more than any of us realized. He opened the box to reveal a time capsule with a letter dated 2 years ago in my grandfather's distinctive handwriting. Found this buried under the oak tree behind your cabin, right where he told me to look if the vultures ever came back. The letter was pure grit. If you're reading this, then Barbara Morrison finally made her move, and hopefully my grandson was smart and out to fight back. The thing about bullies like Barbara is that they count on people being too scared or a solitito stand up to them. But when a community comes together and refuses to be intimidated, even the most elaborations fall apart. He'd suspected Barbara's development connections for years, but couldn't prove it before Hischel declined. The documents in the safe were just the beginning, he wrote. The real power was always in bringing neighbors together to look out for each other. Take care of that community, Marcus. It's worth fighting for. Walking back to our respective homes, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced since moving here. The cabin was no longer just a place to live. It was the center of a community that had learned to protect itself from exploitation and manipulation. But as we reached our driveway, Ryan stopped suddenly. Dad, that car has been parked there for an hour. I looked where he pointed and saw a black SUV with tinted windows close enough to observe our property, but fair enough to avoid attention. The SUV's engine started, and it slowly drove away without headlights. On the rear bumper, I glimpsed the license plate frame reading, Lakeshore Development, Building Tomorrow's Communities. Our fight for the community was far from over. If you've ever felt powerless against someone who seemed to control the entire narrative around you, you know exactly what Marcus went through. We all fear being misunderstood, isolated, and having our truth twisted by people with hidden agendas. If you like this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Alex Stories.